Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third installment of chapter interviews with the authors of our new book, Appalachian Epidemics, From Smallpox to COVID-19, which was just released with University Press of Kentucky. My name is Chris White. I'm a historian at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. And this book project came about kind of organically during the lockdowns. I was on sabbatical in the fall of 2020 as well. And I teamed up with my colleague here at Marshall, Kevin Barksdale, who specializes in Appalachian history. And we started talking about potential authors that we could incorporate into this edited volume. And of course, when we were thinking about early American history and indigenous history and epidemics, then the first name that came to mind was Paul Kelton, who I knew at the University of Kansas before he switched over to Stony Brook. So Dr. Paul Kelton is a professor and Gardner Chair in American History, specializing in Indigenous history, environment, and medicine, all topics I'm very interested in, and early American history. He examines the biological processes involved in the European takeover of the Americas in two books, Epidemics and Enslavement and Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs. His chapter in Appalachian Epidemics is titled Sick from the Start, The Cherokees' Trail of Tears, May to September 1838. Thank you for talking to me today, Paul.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
And so the whole point of these interviews for everyone who's listening is to kind of give you a glimpse of each of the chapters of the book that came out. And the hope is that you're interested enough that you can go out and get a copy of the book. It's available in many different venues, and it's being spread to libraries as well. So first, can you tell us why you focus on the environment, medicine, and disease in your research, as opposed to just political, social, or economic history?
Well, yeah, it goes way back. I mean, the first book I read in grad school in a seminar was Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism. And I got very fascinated by how the spread of disease changed history and how environmental changes are instrumental in understanding the European colonization and conquest of the Americas. But I came in wanting to study indigenous peoples as well. And um, I wanted to put Cherokees at the center of that story and try to understand how they experienced the new diseases that Europeans brought, how they experienced the ecological changes. That led to, my first book where I traced the beginnings of what I think was the first smallpox epidemic to spread through the American South, and that was in the late 1690s. That may or may not have hit the Cherokees. We don't really know for sure, but we know it hit a number of groups around them. And then in my next book, where I looked more specifically at the Cherokees themselves and their medicine and how they responded to these diseases. I mean, I think, biological processes are fundamental to how history unfolds. And, of course, obviously, politics, people making political decisions, generals marching their armies off to war, those are all important too. But germs have changed history dramatically. But it's not just germs, in themselves. They're germs in context of those larger political, economic, and ideological forces.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned Albert Crosby. He comes up in my lectures frequently too. Ecological imperialism and Columbian exchange, and of course his book on the Spanish flu too was very important.
Right.
Yeah, and so building upon that, then it seems like people know about what the Trail of Tears was, or they've heard about it before growing up in America, but a lot of them don't really have the specifics about how diseases played a role. They might hear that there was a lot of people who died, but can you give us a sense of the role of diseases in the Trail of Tears and how that maybe contrasts to the common perception about the Trail of Tears?
Sure. Well, yeah, I don't think that a common view is necessarily wrong, but yeah, it is kind of devoid of details. I mean, the Trail of Tears, I think commonly people know is a very deadly experience for indigenous peoples as they are forced off their homelands in the east and into the west, into what is today Oklahoma and Kansas. Um, but in terms of what particular diseases hit, why they hit, and people's understanding of the time of diseases, that's what I think is not commonly known and what I try to fill in the details. So I first got interested in this topic in my second book on the Cherokees. I was going to go up through removal, looking at how they experienced smallpox. Smallpox for them during removal wasn't as big of a deal as another disease, cholera. And so that led me to investigate the cholera pandemic of 1830s, which is what my current project's on. Um, and it really devastated the Choctaws being removed from Mississippi. And it had some effect on the Cherokees as well. Some Cherokees were moving in 1834, before the major removals in 1838 and 39. It hit a party of Cherokees and killed like 81 Cherokees out of 500, which is high mortality. Um, and what I discovered was that this wasn't unpredicted. I mean, people who opposed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and particularly Native peoples themselves, warned that this experiment, as Jackson himself called it, would have deadly consequences. When you pick up and move people in the 1830s, you don't have Greyhound buses and interstate highways. When you pick them up and move them about 1,000 miles, that's a logistical undertaking that's very difficult. And how is that going to happen? How are you going to feed people? How are you going to protect them from the elements? How are you going to keep them in clean and sanitary environments? Those are some of the questions that opponents to Indian removal asked. And the consequences they warned would be very deadly. And those indeed played out with the Choctaws. And then, of course, with the Cherokees in the 1830s, they played out as well. And so what I think I add to this is not that simply, Native peoples were put on the Trail of Tears and, unfortunately they died. Is that Native peoples were forced on the Trail of Tears knowing that there would be severe epidemiological consequences, but those consequences were deemed acceptable by the Democratic Party at the time and Southern politicians who were pushing for removal.
And this kind of thing where you actually move people from one location and transplant them to another, and then you concentrate them for a period of time in pens or whatever it might be. This type of thing plays out many, many times throughout modern history, and you see
Sure.
similar results.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're talking about forced deportations, which is, what we could call Indian removal, and I think Claudio Sant in his book on Indian removal, I think is quite correct by calling this, deportation rather than removal. Actually, removal at the time was a word that had a very kind of neutral connotation. When someone picked up and moved their business from one town to the next, they called it a removal. And so the removal was a kind of a soft sounding word. But deportation is a word, of course, that means actually people that don't want to leave are being forced to leave. And deportation was what really was at work here. And when you're talking about people against their will being forced into circumstances where they can't control, you certainly have the potential for infectious diseases to spread. And that was the case with the Cherokee removal. When the Treaty of New Echota deadline was reached May 23rd, 1838, U.S. troops under General Scott, Georgia soldiers in the Georgia Guard, the Tennessee Volunteers, they come in and they round up Cherokees and they force them into these confined camps in which, people are, right on top of each other. Sanitation breaks down. If one person is carrying measles, then that spreads to other people that lacked immunity to that. And it was just an epidemiological nightmare in the first basically month of the roundups of the Cherokees.
I see. And it's the kind of thing that could have been predicted, right? I mean, this is something that the federal government is orchestrating on its own.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they knew that. I mean, they knew smallpox, for example, might be a problem. And in the time, smallpox vaccine was readily available. No one understood why smallpox vaccine worked. We know it now as when you insert cowpox into a human body, it promotes the development of immunity to a related disease, smallpox. And so people were being vaccinated before the 1830s, and the Cherokees themselves underwent a vaccination program in 1824 of their own kind of design.
Hmm.
And in the spring of 1838, the War Department sends the civilian superintendent of Cherokee removal, Nathaniel Smith, vaccine matter and instructs him to vaccinate 15,000 Cherokees with 5 doctors and do this very quickly. And of course, that was, not going to happen because that logistically would be very difficult. But it shows that there was kind of this understanding. Oh, yeah, by the way, the disease is going to spread. We might want to do something about it. Nathaniel Smith never did anything about it, as far as we know. The first Cherokees to move in late May and early June of 1838 were sent by steamboat to as far west as basically Little Rock, and then they had to walk the last leg of the journey. Were not vaccinated against smallpox, and some may have been early in their early ages back in 1824, but there were a number that weren't. And what you see is when they get in the West, where there's a smallpox epidemic happen, a number of them contract the disease, and you have high mortality. So yeah, people knew. I mean, it's not you can't. I remember one of my colleagues saying, well, this was before germ theory. People didn't really understand how diseases spread. Well, they didn't understand specifically what caused diseases, but they understood in certain circumstances diseases grow rampant. And those circumstances were when people are confined, when people are put on steamboats, were notorious for being germ factories. I mean, they call it germ factories at the time, but the word stinking or filthy, an adjective that often was put before steamboats in the 1830s. Because unless you were a first class passenger that could ride in a cabin, you really didn't, you knew being on a steamboat was a risk to your health.
Right. Even though this is all before Dr. Snow and the Broad Street Pump, where they
Uh,
discover epidemiology and public health and things like that, and well before Koch and Pasteur with the germ theory disease, they understood. I mean, during the plague times, right? They understood that you had to quarantine ships off the shore, and that was hundreds of years before too. Um,
uh,
yeah, and each of these diseases is so different too, right? The smallpox is different than measles, is different than cholera. These are all old world diseases that the Native Americans didn't have as much immunity against.
well, yes and no. Um, smallpox, you only get immunity by having the disease or being vaccinated. And so no one, is born with any kind of immunity to smallpox. There may be, through a mother's milk, some antibodies passed that might give some protection to infants that wears off fairly quickly. Um, and measles as well. Um, Cholera is a newcomer to the Americas. It didn't arrive to the Americas until 1832. And when it arrived, Euro Americans, African Americans, Indigenous Americans were all essentially no one had immunity to it.
Sure.
Yeah, and so what you see, I mean, you see in New York City in the summer of 1832, about 4,000 people dying from cholera, and half the city evacuates, panics, and flees from it. And elites in New York City, for example, they knew to get out of town and protect themselves. But Choctaws being forced out of their homeland, they didn't have a choice. They don't have any land left, and they're being forced to gather in Memphis. And at the same time, where, the cholera is coming down the Mississippi River aboard these steamboats, and when Choctaws get on the steamboats, their cholera spreads. So, with the Cherokees in the roundup in the 1838s, interestingly, Cherokees did not experience cholera in their homeland. Cholera is a disease that it spreads through fecal contaminated water, through poor sewage. And so drainage plays a role. And the Cherokees were pretty well protected. They're in the southern Appalachians. And as best we can tell, cholera did not have as much impact in the southern Appalachians as it did in, say, the lower Mississippi Valley or urban places, plantations in Georgia and South Carolina in the low country. So the Cherokees were pretty protected from cholera. And, they're why in 1836, About 700 enslaved African Americans die on plantations in South Carolina. Um, the disease doesn't spread among Cherokees in New Echota and other places. But once they're driven out of the mountains and into these concentration camps, they are subject to bacterial diseases. Cholera had disappeared by 1838 and wasn't one of the diseases that hit the Cherokees on the Trail of Tears. But ordinary dysentery spread through sewage contaminated water does hit. Whooping cough hits. Measles hits. Um, Typhoid, another of these diseases that spread through contaminated water, hits. Measles and whooping cough aren't spread through contaminated water, but nonetheless, in these concentration camps, on the steamboats, Cherokees subject to all kinds of different diseases.
This is all so fascinating. Learning about all this, even though it's a horrible situation, diseases, pandemics, seems infinitely more fascinating than my research that I conducted for my Latin American history PhD too. Uh,
Yeah,
it seems
yeah.
like it just goes throughout all of history.
We're kind of hopefully. I mean, it's a good thing, right? We understand more. We those old paradigms that we learned in grad school are being revised, and we're understanding the complexity of infectious diseases. There's a lot of fascinating research going on. Even the anthropologists are doing DNA studies that of corpses in medieval Europe to determine whether they died of bubonic plague, and they're finding some interesting things. And so we're learning a lot more about infectious diseases and their role in history.
So important to understand the kind of the context. It seems to me that that's what I was trying to understand, the context of COVID at the time. And it was just the latest in a series of many others that are caused by a combination of microbes and human behaviors and geography, immunology, things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thanks
Yeah.
so much. I really look forward to reading your next work on cholera too. And this is focusing on the Ohio River Valley, is that right?
Well, it's focused on the United States and its territories from 1832 to 1836. It's really the first kind of point of debate whether this was the first global pandemic,
Mm.
cholera in the 1830s. I mean, you see from 1830, it spread from Russia, and by 1837, it had circled the globe at least once, and it's in Latin America, it's in Italy. In between those years, it hit the United States, it hit Mexico, it hit Japan. It's everywhere. There's some debate, of course. Smallpox spread globally before, yellow fever spread globally before. But the thing about cholera in the 1830s is people really understood it was a global pandemic because they could read about it in the newspapers, and they really conceived of it as kind of a modern one newspaper editor called it this modern pandemic, or I didn't just say pandemic, this modern epidemic. Um, so I'm focused on the United States. I wanted to limit my view to kind of dive deeply into how people experienced it, their personal experiences with fear, loss, suffering, and how that contrasted with um, kind of the public narrative that was perpetuated by temperance advocates, moral reformers, newspaper editors, and others about how this was basically, nothing to be afraid of, and it was a mild thing, but people didn't experience it that way. It was a very terrible and horrifying disease. And so I show that contrast in this book.
And it seems like there needs to be more mention of epidemics like that in American history books too. The general kind of unified histories that are out there tend to gloss over these epidemics. They might mention Spanish flu in passing or something like that, right? Civil War histories too, right? There's just so much damage that microbes and the conditions that leaders are putting people in, which cause these dramatic outbreaks.
Yeah, I would say I didn't find a book. The reason I wrote this book is I was doing the Indian removal project, and this book, this article that you asked me to include in, thankfully, I appreciate it,
Yeah.
being included in this edited volume. And I thought, oh, surely there's a book on the cholera pandemic in the 1830s into the United States. And there really wasn't. I mean, you can go back and look at Charles Rosenberg wrote a book back in the 1960s on America in the cholera years, and he focuses mostly on New York City in 1832, 1849, and then 1866. And then there's books on cholera, kind of really macro histories about how it spread and, kind of how fitting it into a narrative of progress of science that, well, this was a nasty disease that human beings ultimately figured out. And you mentioned John Snow figuring out how it spread through the water, and then Koch discovering the bacteria that spread, and then improvements were made. But that kind of obscures how terrible it was for people and how they experienced in a time when there was no solution. But yeah, you're right. Cholera in the 1830s doesn't really show up too much in biographies of Andrew Jackson or treatments of Jacksonian America. But if you read a newspaper in the summer and fall of 1832, it is dominated by cholera news, not the election, not the nullification crisis, but cholera. And part of, the newspaper editors are writing about it, but part of the reason why we kind of forget about in history is that deliberate effort of, people with power to obscure its damage. Jackson himself, just like with Indian removal, Jackson, constantly said about Indian removal that this was a successful experiment. The Indians are happy, nothing to see here, folks. It's all great. It wasn't, obviously, and Native peoples knew that, and Jackson's opponents knew that. With cholera, Jackson mentioned it once publicly in his annual addresses. And basically in December of 1832, he says, well, unlike other countries, we came across very it hit us, very lightly. At the time he was writing this, over 6,000 people had died in New Orleans of cholera,
Just in New Orleans.
uh,
Wow.
just in New Orleans. And that's like and what makes that number really frighteningly high is most people that could had got out of New Orleans beforehand. So
Yeah.
it's hitting a population that's already reduced in size. It's like I believe like 20% of the population that was in residence in New Orleans died from this nasty disease. It's in the newspapers, but Jackson's saying, well, compared to Russia or other countries, we came across very with a light blow. So
Gosh.
that's one of the reasons why it's not there because it didn't fit kind of in the narrative that we were this free, enlightened people that would withstand this nasty, loathsome disease.
Yeah. Gosh. Again, another example of why it's so fascinating. And we haven't even got into all the epidemiology and the symptoms and the treatments of all these diseases too, which is has there's so much information about that that the medical community has come up with too. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope everybody goes out there and who's listening goes out there and checks out a copy of the book Appalachian Epidemics from Smallpox to COVID-19. And in case you haven't guessed yet, that from smallpox part came from chapter 1 from Dr. Kelton's chapter on the Trail of Tears. So thanks so much, and I look forward to possibly to reading your work when it comes out, your next work.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it. It's a great edited volume, and yeah, people could learn a lot from it.
Definitely. All right, thanks.
Thank you.